Hello everyone, this is Anton Garcia-Fernandez
Erin Garcia-Fernandez.
and we are here in our kitchen in Jackson, Tennessee with some coffee right here. I'm not going to say what kind of coffee because we don't get sponsored by anybody to do these talks. And we're going to be having a conversation on a TV show that we've watched recently and that has been a huge hit on Netflix in the past few weeks, and we're talking about
The Haunting of Hill House.
The Haunting of Hill House. It's a show directed by Mike Flanagan, who is a director that's well known for his horror movies, and this is indeed a horror show. It is based on a novel that was written and published originally back in 1959 by a writer that I didn't know much about until we watched this show and we heard about her for the first time. Her name is Shirley Jackson, and like I said, the novel was published originally in 1959. She apparently had been publishing short stories, sort of like horror, suspense kind of short stories in the New Yorker prior to this, and she has been termed by some critics as one of the best writers of short stories that are horror short stories in the 20th century. And this novel has been classified as one of the best Gothic novels of the 20th century. Now, Erin has read the book. I have not read the book, but Erin has, and so we're going to be making mention of the book several times. Mostly Erin talking about the book.
Yeah. Well, and then my one reservation about going ahead with this conversation, but we're going to do it, is that there are two earlier versions of this story, film adaptations. One from 1963,
I think, yeah.
And then one from
I think 99.
99. Okay. I've seen the one from 99. I saw it when it came out, and I have vague memories of it. I have not seen the one from 63, and when I saw the one from 99, I mean, that was a mighty long time ago, so we have not refreshed our memories about those earlier film adaptations, but we're going to be talking about the Netflix show and the book.
Yeah, the show is on Netflix right now. It's out on Netflix, so if you got a chance, watch it, because, of course, if you're listening to our conversation without having watched the show, maybe that's not the best idea, because there's going to be some spoilers. Which, this is not really a review to tell you whether you should watch it or not, because by all means you should watch it. But if you haven't watched it, maybe you should pause right now, stop the recording, and watch the show first, and then maybe listen to our conversation.
Well, and the same for the book. If you're wanting to read the book, it's not really long. It's 233 pages of the Penguin edition that I have, and it's a pretty fast read. But if you're wanting to read the book and not, and you don't want to hear what happens, we'll probably be talking about some of that today. So,
since you mentioned that about the book, there's a Penguin Classics edition that has an introduction, and then there is one that actually has the same cover as the Netflix show, which does not have an introduction. It's just the text, and that's the one you used, actually.
Yeah, because that's what was available at the library. The other one was checked out with the introduction. I would like to get the other one and read the introduction. I would recommend that if you have your choice of what to get. I didn't know very much about Shirley Jackson either, and I don't I don't read a lot of horror. I don't know a lot about the genre, and so I would like an introduction to sort of a critical perspective on it. I can talk a little bit about the history of the genre, because I can talk a bit about Victorian horror, late Victorian horror, namely Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. But beyond that, I will wholeheartedly admit that I don't know a whole lot about Shirley Jackson from a critical perspective. and so, but I'm interested to know more now that I've read her book.
And you've read the book, and that will give us a chance to sort of compare how the story in the book has been adapted to this 10-episode Netflix show directed by Mike Flanagan. Now, talking about the show, one thing that was at first very interesting to me regarding the show before we even watched it was how widely acclaimed it has been since it first came out on Netflix. I have seen 4.5 and 5 out of 5-star reviews. I've seen glowing reviews from people that are respected in the field of horror literature and horror movies, namely Stephen King. There's somebody in Spain with whom I'm acquainted, David Roas, who is a specialist in the Gothic novel and fantastic literature, who mentioned that he had really, really enjoyed the show. And I thought, well, if they like the show, I need to watch the show, even though we don't really watch a lot of horror shows because...
That's my fault.
That's true. I must say that you get scared pretty easily with these shows, and so we don't watch too many of those.
Well, and it's strange because, I don't know, I like to say I have a very vivid imagination. So, I know, and Anton's always telling me if we're watching something scary, it's not real. Why are you scared? And of course, I know it's not real, but I have a very strong, willing suspension of disbelief, I guess, when we're watching horror films. I don't know. And so, yeah, I don't watch a lot of horror. I mean, what I have watched over the years. I've seen The Shining, and I've seen my share of scary things, but I usually watch them with a blanket over my head, or Anton tells me what's happening.
Well, you suspend disbelief, and you suspend the watching as well. You hide behind a
I'm there,
pillow
I'm
or
watching.
something, and then I have to narrate to you what's happening on the screen, like if I were a baseball announcer or something.
But it's strange too, because I've always been a bit like that when it comes to watching scary things, but I've also had an interest. And it's strange, but when I used to really want to be a writer, and an editor, and then I got my PhD in Victorian literature, but one of my earlier memories of, realizing how much I liked writing, I think happened when I was in the 6th grade, and we had been learning about the plague in school. And I think we were assigned, I don't know exactly, but we were assigned to write some sort of a story about the plague. And I remember thinking it was so cool that you could write about something that would get such a visceral reaction from an audience. I don't know, that stands out to me. And, I was... and still am quite a scaredy cat, but the thought of being able to describe something that gave somebody else the shivers just fascinated me. So maybe that's why I read this book, because I wanted to know, okay, what's so scary?
Yeah, my first introduction to horror and the supernatural was, of course, Edgar Allan Poe, and then you mentioned Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, which has always been one of my favorite novels, which I read originally in Spanish and then in the original English. Now, talking about the show, I would like to concentrate, first of all, if that's okay with you, Erin, on the positive aspects of the show, things that the show has done well. Actually, this is not a faithful translation into images of the novel by Shirley Jackson.
No, not at all.
So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think one thing that they did very well in this show is the connection between the present and the past.
Yeah. You brought that up to me a couple days ago, and I thought you had a very strong point. If you want to, recall your comments.
There's always a visual or mostly visual connection between what happens in the present and what happens in the past, because of course the same characters are involved in what happens in the present and what happens in the past. In the past, they're kids. In the present, they're adults, and there's always a certain kind of visual component that links both
because
time periods.
it's not a linear narrative. It jumps back and forth quite a bit.
I think for the most part they do that well.
Yeah.
It gets a little bit more complicated to understand as the show goes on. I don't think they do it as well in the later episodes as they do it in the earlier ones. But that's one thing that I think is well done.
And it does. I think it. I don't know if I should use this word, but it kind of ensnares you as a viewer because it seems very well thought out. You know, like a puzzle that's going to come together somehow. And I don't mean to suggest, you know, like a Scooby-Doo episode that they have to reveal the logical explanation for everything that happens in the supernatural story, but you just have the impression that the storytellers, you know, the filmmakers, they're presenting something that's been crafted, you know. And so yes, I agree that that jumping, which can be disorienting and probably in some ways is meant to be disorienting, it still links you to certain objects or themes and things that connect the past and the present.
Another thing that I thought was very well done in the movie is the acting. I think the acting is fantastic. Some really good actors here that appear in this show. You know, from Timothy Hutton, who's on here, to Michael Heisman or Huisman. I'm not sure how to pronounce that because I think he is
Dutch?
from Holland, I think. And then you know. Carla Gugino.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that well.
She's always one of my favorites. I really I liked her in The Buccaneers years and years ago.
Henry Thomas, Elizabeth Reeser, Oliver Jackson Cohen, Kate Siegel, Victoria Pedretti. I mean, everyone.
Annabeth Gish.
That's right. Exactly. Everybody does a great job, I think, as far as acting is concerned. I think the movie, for the most, the
kids
show,
do a good job too. The child actors, I think, because you know a lot of times that doesn't always work out. But I thought they were pretty natural.
They're natural. They're believable. And you know the directing is pretty good too.
Yeah.
I think that from a technical standpoint. From an acting standpoint, the show is really good. So that's another thing that is positive about the show. Another thing that I find positive about the show that maybe Erin may disagree with me on this a little bit because we've talked about this before. We've actually been talking about this for several days now, weeks maybe, before we're recording this now with our coffee. Is the fact that there are certain characters that do get in the TV show a pretty interesting, in my opinion, backstory.
Yeah.
For example, the character of Luke, who has problems with drugs, and I think that kind of fleshes out the character really well and makes his behavior a little bit more believable in the present. Once you know what happened to him in the past and the problems that he has had.
Yes, I agree. It's nice that, well, and I think when we were talking about this before, I said I liked how they gave you the different perspectives of the characters. I mean, and they would backtrack on their timeline and show you things that they had already shown you from the other character's perspective. And so they had that overlapping, and in the process of showing you those overlapping perspectives, and you see how different they really are. I mean, there's that disjointedness that is a feeling that obviously they get in Hill House in a material way, and that's one thing. And I'm not going to start talking about the book much yet, but that happens in Shirley Jackson's book. Is that they're in this house that's in many different ways materially disjointed. It's disorienting and it's weird and it's off. And I think that by showing those overlapping perspectives with the backstories and that adds some nice conflict, and it starts to add depth.
That's true. And then there's something else that I think was pretty well done, and that has to do with one of the characters in particular, and that's the character of Nell. And again, this would be a spoiler because, as we said at the beginning, you shouldn't be listening to us talking about this show until you've actually watched the 10 episodes of the show. But I think the introduction of this bent-necked lady is really well done because she appears pretty early on, and it's haunting the character of Nell.
Right.
And little by little, one starts wondering about the identity of this bent-necked lady. Who is it? Who could she be?
Right.
And as the show progresses and we get halfway through it, pretty much, we finally realize that the bent-necked lady is Nell herself, and that she has been haunting herself and actually leading herself to commit suicide.
That's kind of the climax, actually, of the whole, I would argue, of the whole series. I mean, quite a bit happens after you realize that, but that's kind of the height of the horror for me in the show, because there is this build-up, right, of this little girl who's been haunted most of her life. It's kind of stopped a little bit for part of her I don't know, young years, but then it comes back, and you don't. And it's very disturbing, and obviously it drives her. It's one of the things that drives her back to the house, and she, into her end. But you don't really realize who it is. Now, one thing that they do in the film, and I think that they did this in a different way in the Haunting from 1999, is they play a lot with women's hair. The female character's hair, because they have all these women, except for Mrs. Dudley, who have long hair. The mother, Mrs. Crane, in this Netflix show, she has long hair. Nell has long hair. Theo has the long hair. The other sister, what's her name? That's terrible. I'm blanking on it. But the one who works as a mortician. Her hair's not quite as long, but there's this sort of blurring, and you wonder, is the bent-neck lady the mother? Because at some point you realize the mother has died, or is it? And so you don't know until, for a while, that it's Nell herself, and that is quite disturbing, that you realize she's been haunting herself. And so, I mean, that was well done.
I think you were talking about Shirley.
Shirley, yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Shirley. I guess Shirley for
Shirley Jackson.
Okay,
yeah.
there you go.
Well, and up to that, I think those four elements, I think, are what I like the most about the show. When we're talking about the show from a positive standpoint, those things are what I find really appealing about the show. I don't know if there are any others that you might have.
I might say two other things, and I haven't even fleshed out what I really think about these two moments, but Theo, at one point early on, is interviewing a little girl, and she is talking about Mr. Smiley, and you realize, because Theo has these powers, she finds out that this girl's foster father has been abusing her, and I actually thought that story was pretty compelling, because it showed how, I mean, Theo's pretty explicit about it, maybe more so than need be, but it shows how people lie to themselves, and how these elements of horror get into our stories. The other thing that I thought was interesting was when Steve, at the beginning, he goes to this woman's house, and the idea is that he's looking for ghost stories to tell. And this woman tells this story about her husband seeing his dead body, and so he stays up all night, and he experiences some scary things, but he's able to explain them. And I don't know, the thing that I liked about that was that the show was acknowledging I don't know, just like a different trend from from a lot of what was going on in the show, because the show's all about supernatural experiences, but there is that drive that a lot of people have to just explain things logically. And I, in a way, wish they would have done a little bit more with it as the show continued. And I realized I pulled up 2 examples where the horror doesn't really exist. It's been explained away. And I said before, I don't necessarily need it to be a Scooby-Doo episode where all of the supernatural elements get explained away. And yet, I think when you use logic to explain away the supernatural elements, you start to see more true horror sometimes, because
it's much more effective.
Horror doesn't have to be supernatural. So I like that was in there.
And in fact, horror is more effective if it's not supernatural, completely supernatural, right?
Right.
Because there's enough horror in real life.
Right. And there can be that mix in a story, because as the little girl points out, like, we tell ourselves stories. Sometimes we tell ourselves stories to distract, or we just can't acknowledge or even realize the truth. And so, I mean, telling ghost stories and thinking about supernatural things is all a part of the human experience. So it's not that I don't want any of that in there, but I was hoping to have a little bit more of those kinds of elements that I was glad were in there, at least initially, because there is this desire to go, why are we freaking ourselves out?
You're listening to a conversation on The Haunting of Hill House with Anton
and Erin.
And we're here in our kitchen in Jackson, Tennessee, in the United States of America, and we're having coffee. In fact, Erin is going to be giving me right now a little bit of a refill. She has her own. We have some brownies as well, so we're doing fine. And chatting about this show that's right now out on Netflix and that we recommend that you watch, because for the most part we enjoyed it. We had a good time, but there are some things about it that we haven't liked as much as we had hoped, especially after all the hype that we had read about people fainting while they were watching the show. I don't know how that is possible, since we were fine. I was hoping I would faint at some point, because it's never happened to me, fortunately, but it didn't happen.
Well, like I said before, I'm quite a scaredy cat, and I will admit that I watched this with my head in Anton's shoulder half the time. So I mean,
that was fine with me.
If you're concerned about being too scared to watch it, hopefully you're not still listening to this anyway. But if you haven't watched it yet, but I would say it's not that bad. It's not, don't watch it, I guess, by yourself at night, maybe? I don't know, but it's not that bad.
We've talked a little bit about the positive elements, some of the things that we really liked that were done by Mike Flanagan, the director of this show. But I think one of the main problems with this show, and I think it will become more apparent as we begin talking about the book and comparing a little bit what they've done with the show regarding the book, is the fact that I think the story overall has very little depth.
Yeah, I think this was something that was a big disappointment for me as well. We thought initially it had a lot of pieces to the puzzle. Like I said, you felt like they had taken their time to go back and forth between the past and the present, and between different perspectives. And like Anton said, they had similar visual elements to link things, and it seemed intricate. And yet, as it went on, it didn't have the threads didn't all come together. It didn't turn into a big picture. It ended up being a disappointment.
And I think one of the reasons has to do with the presentation of the horror, or the scary parts, and I think that's an important thing to talk about, because I think in this show they're using a lot of cheap thrills, a lot of quick scares, but they build up to a certain point where you think that something scary is going to happen, and then boom, it happens.
Right.
And that's it.
Right.
I don't think that, from my perspective, is the most effective way to present horror or to release the tension.
Right.
Because it releases the tension very quickly, and then there's nothing right after.
Well,
And in that respect, I like the philosophy of Alfred Hitchcock, which he talks about in his conversations with François Truffaut, the French director, where he talks about giving information to the spectator, to the audience, before actually presenting the horrific element,
Right.
or the element of terror, because in that way you are creating a certain suspense that
Right.
goes along with the horror, and it's not something that lasts just
Right.
as little as short, that
As
is
a
as short
moment.
as lightning striking,
Yeah, that's easy for you to say.
I can't talk today. I don't know what's going
No,
on.
but
Maybe
you're
it's the
right.
coffee.
No, you're right. It's the closest I think that they get to that is the build up to the revelation about the bent neck lady. But a lot goes into all of these perspectives and all of this drawn out drama about the family, and what it seems to come down to when you start to really get all of the perspectives is it's the house. It's just the house. It's just a haunted house because that, like, in and of itself, and it's driving this family to haunt itself. And that just really, like, the bottom fell out for me there. I'm not saying, that the house can't be haunted. But for me, the strongest stories, if they use the supernatural, they still tie back to some major, substantial struggles of a personal nature, or psychological nature, emotional. And I felt like you're supposed to believe they're doing that because you see this mother unraveling, except that there wasn't any real clear reason why. Now you might say, well, they had a ton of kids and they were worried about their money, and she had these headaches, but the kids seemed to be on their own, really. They weren't driving the mother crazy. She seemed to be okay, and they had financial problems, but then this didn't really turn into an argument between the mom and dad about finances. You find out at one point that the mother's father died when she was young, and she has a monologue about that, which is actually a monologue from the book. I can talk about that in a bit. And so you're kind of trying to feel like that's compelling. Maybe you think that the house is just haunting her because of some other family that lived there and had a really tragic, horrible story, except that doesn't really come together much. And there doesn't seem to be a reason. Like, why are they haunting themselves? Why is Nell haunting herself?
That, to me, is one of the biggest problems with this plot, with the plot that they chose to build for this TV show. And also the fact that, to go back to what I was saying about Hitchcock's idea on horror and suspense, is that really the audience of the TV show, The Haunting of Hill House, really a lot of information is withdrawn from us by I think the name of the character, is it Hugh?
Hugh Crane.
Yeah, Hugh Crane. Because he doesn't explain to his kids what has happened with the mother, with his wife, when they were kids and they were living in this hill house. And by doing that to his kids, to the characters in the story, we also are left with no information whatsoever. We're left to wonder what's going on. We don't really have a lot of information about what has happened. And I think that, again, makes the story less attractive and less effective, to such an extent that one wonders, why is a haunted house attractive to us as an audience? It is not because the house can physically kill a character or a person. It's got to be for a different reason. It's got to be because it's old, it's extraneous, it's strange. It's something from a different time.
Well, and it seems abandoned. And so if it's abandoned, then somebody else's intentions were abandoned, or somebody else's home, somebody else's love, or, comfort. It's, I mean, and I think that kind of creepiness, that you can find that in literature in many different places. People who are, you know, displaced people. Irish big house fiction talks quite a bit about, these absentee landlords who left these giant estates, and what happens to the people in the area. But then there are these empty houses full of, expensive things that are falling apart, and that, are, so there's, and I'm not speaking very articulately about that because that's a whole other subject I don't know how to get into quickly, but there are, you can see very beautiful, intricate, expensive things that someone put a lot of time and effort into. And I guess you have two feelings of what happened if this was so valuable, that it was abandoned like this. And then the other idea is that why was so much time and effort put into material things rather than personal things, personal experiences. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think they really fell flat with that because the house could be fascinating. And
it is.
And it is fascinating. And yet it didn't make a connection for me with these characters. It didn't work.
And then something else that really ties into this idea of the plot maybe not having as much depth as it should or maybe could have, is the fact that all the problems that the family has end up being explained away by one of the characters, I believe it was Steve or Steven, right? As a problem with the genes. It's in our genes, he says. And, it is hard for me to believe, really, that this is a possible, a plausible, or even an effective explanation for everything that has been going on until then. It's hard to believe that the problem with this family really is something that is simply genetic.
Yeah, I mean, and the idea is that it's mental health issues that are in the genes, but I mean, that's a very flat explanation. I used to teach Robert Browning's Porphyria's Lover, and the narrator in that poem kills a girl, and the students were always very excited to say, he's crazy. And it's like, well, okay, but that's not interesting. I mean, if you think he's crazy, why do you think he's crazy? I mean, to just hollow something out and say, well, the family's crazy, it's in our genes, is pretty boring. And then, unfortunately, the tension that the show puts against that is, if they're not crazy, then it's the house. It's just the house. It's it's an evil house. And a little bit of that comes from Shirley Jackson's novel, but I feel like she deals with it in quite a different way. And that just doesn't do it for me either. I don't know. I mean, one of the things they do in the film is they try to give importance to bits and pieces from the house. So you learn a little bit about the clock and the clockmaker, and you realize, oh, the clockmaker or fixer or whatever wasn't really there. Stephen fixes up a vanity for his mother, which you wonder if it's going to have any value to the story, to the plot, and more depth. But really, the value it holds is that she looks in the mirror and she sees something scary. I mean, it's just the value.
Another cheap thrill.
Right. The value every time seems to be, oh, you're scared. Mm-hmm. And that can't be the value all by itself. Because you have to be able to ask, why is this so scary? And it doesn't, and if you go, oh, well, it's in the genes or it's the house, neither one of those options is very satisfying.
And then, there's this tree house that supposedly was built when these kids were small, and they get to the house, which supposedly their parents are flipping in order to sell and be able to build their dream house with the money. We see in the earlier episodes that these kids, especially one of them, were up in that tree house and spent a lot of time there. But then later on, we learn that that tree house was never there, a little bit like the clock, right? But the problem is, this is not shown by means of an image, but it's actually told. As in, oh, by the way, that tree house that you remember wasn't really there. And I don't think that's as effective, again, as maybe using a different way of telling the story, a different technique, and maybe showing more than telling in this case.
Hugh Crane explains that to Stephen when he's grown and they're going back to the house. And he says, these things weren't really there. And you're right, he just comes out and explains that, which is a shame because they have taken the time to show you these things, and you're supposed to take for granted that these kids are doing these things and they're there. So I don't quite know why they didn't take a little bit more time to show you that they weren't there, to let that be a little bit more scary. I think, to be honest, and I'm sorry to make a joke about this, but one of the strangest things to me about the story for this show, I found it kind of funny that they made it a flip or flop kind of a thing, because there's so much of that on TV these days. And yet, this family that's supposed to be this loving family, that's the unfortunate, victims of this haunted house, they don't do anything, these parents, when their children start to become traumatized by the ghosts in this house. Now, I guess you're supposed to think that they just don't really believe in ghosts and they're trying to tell their kids, but like if one child after the other in your family becomes traumatized, several of them have really strong experiences, screaming and terrifying experiences, and the parents are like, we gotta flip this house. Like that in and of itself, as a portrait of maybe displaced priorities, is interesting, but it just didn't have the depth. And even though they tried to give Luke quite a bit of depth, they give Nell a little bit of depth, but not much. She's just kind of a victim, mostly. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, she reminds me of Nell from Dickens's The Old Curiosity Shop, who has to... sorry, if you haven't read Old Curiosity Shop, I'm going to give it away right now. So, Nell dies.
I'm not reading it then. It's a long novel.
But I mean, it was known at the time for really getting people worked up, and they wanted to know. And there's a story about people waiting at the docks in Boston for the last parts of the book to arrive in America, and people going, is Nell okay? Did Nell make it? And
as though she were a real person.
Yeah, I mean, people were seriously caught up, and she is a victim. She's like, she has to, in a sense, be sacrificed in the story, and they do that to Nell in the film. I mean, she just has to be the one who, succumbs, and then I don't know. The other thing I really disliked about what they did was at the end, she ends up in the haunted house with the spirits of her mother and father, and then you kind of get back to this, oh, well, at least they've been reunited. They can sort of be happy together while the rest of the kids go off and live their lives.
Which is very much unlike, classic haunted house stories.
Yeah, I was like, what is with the ending? And then Mr. Dudley takes Mrs. Dudley into the house so her spirit can live on. I hated that.
Just like the spirit of Hugh's wife, the mother of all these kids, actually lived on in his imagination and communicates with him.
And then you have this family who has all these problems, but really the marriage was great. They didn't have any problems. They didn't argue. I think he even says that. Like they separated when Stephen was a baby, but then they got back together, and I mean, like, that's it. But they go through all these problems, but they were always in love. What? I don't know. I don't like that at all.
You're listening to a conversation on the TV show The Haunting of Hill House with Anton
and Erin.
We are almost done with our coffee, and I think it's probably about time to talk a little bit about the book, which you have in your hands right there, one of the newer Penguin editions of it.
Yeah.
And because, of course, this TV show, The Haunting of Hill House, is actually based on this 1959 novel by Shirley Jackson, which has been dubbed as one of the best ghost stories of the 20th century, if not the best. But the truth is, the show seems to pick scattered parts, sometimes really minor parts of the novel, to build a completely or majorly different story. I haven't read it, so this is Erin's time to shine, because we're going to be talking about this novel, and she is the one that actually has taken the time to read it.
Well, so I found the show so dissatisfying that in an effort to try and understand it better, I wanted to read the book, and I also wanted to see if I could read the book, because as I've admitted, I'm quite the scaredy cat, and so I wanted to see if I could read the book, and I did, and it is scary and disturbing, but not really in the way that I expected. And Anton's right, it is completely different from the show. And I just really regret what they did to the Netflix show. I don't know. For me, in reading this novel, it's let me put it this way. It's like 230 something pages. I got, more than 100 pages into it, and nothing scary had happened. And I mean that quite literally. And I think in many ways that was very well done, because it's making you wait, right? And a large part of, and Anton was saying, why is it that we are drawn to haunted houses? Why do we want to go in them? Why are they're eerie, they're creepy. We want to try and imagine, can we imagine what would leave things in that state? Can we imagine something that would horrify us so that we would end up, abandoning our homes, or, whatever, families falling apart, murders happening, I don't know, whatever it is, whatever horrible thing you can imagine. We want to experience not just the horror, but the imagining of it. Mm-hmm. And as you're getting halfway through the book, you're like, okay, well...
You're not giving me much.
Well, but you're kind of waiting for it, and a lot of the story, not all of it, but a lot of it's told from Eleanor's perspective, and she acknowledges, like, you're waiting for things to happen. It's about 4 people who go to a house. One of them is a doctor who's interested in the supernatural, and this house has been said to have supernatural things going on, and they want to experience it and write down notes and figure out what's going on.
But no family element.
No, there's nobody's related, and they want to experience things, and they're waiting, and I mean, that's pretty unnerving to begin with. But it also allows for Shirley Jackson to set up, and I'm sorry, every time I say her name, I can't quite get her name out, but it allows for her to set up personal relationships and psychological portraits of the characters. And again, her primary focus is Nell. The doctor, Dr. Montague, has written to Nell and Theo and other people, but only Nell and Theodora are the ones who respond, and they come and they want to take notes. Luke is the fourth person who's brought along because he is related to the current owner of the house, and the current owner, Mrs. Sanderson, wants a family member to be present while they.
So that's the only connection.
That's the only connection.
To a family.
Yeah, and it's, they hear about another family, the Crane family. Hugh Crane is the man who originally built the house, and so you do hear about his family, and there are some tragic accidents that happen, but so much of this book is driven by Nell, and so I just think it is really a shame the way, for me, even with the climax of The Bent Neck Lady, the Netflix show hollowed out her character because she only comes across as a victim. In The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, she's actually a pretty disturbing, annoying, pitiful character. There's moments where you can be hopeful for her, but she's lived a very sheltered, isolated life, and she has taken care of her dying mother. She has a very bad relationship with her grown sister, and she is described as incredibly awkward, socially awkward, and the narration says it's not really her own fault. These circumstances in her life just sort of led her to develop in that way, but she lives very much in her imagination, and the whole time she's driving to the house, she's imagining all these adventures and things that that she could go on and be a part of, and she's got very high hopes of the relationships that she's going to build on this little experience, and you expect that for everybody else. It's going to be not life-altering. It's just going to be like a weird, quirky experiment that they're doing together. Eleanor takes it very seriously, and you see that from the beginning. And so I think it's unfortunate that they didn't do more of that in this new Netflix version. That being said, the older Haunting, the 1999 Haunting, I believe, does actually follow more of Shirley Jackson's novel. I only remember it vaguely, and I think they kind of overdid, the supernatural effects, and I don't think it was an amazing movie, but it does certainly follow the book more. I can't speak to the 1963 version, but the other thing that it does is when Eleanor, Theo, the doctor, and Luke get to the house, so much of what you're focused on is their interactions, because they're waiting to be scared, right? And they're in this awkward house. They have to find their way around. And so they're trying to make relationships with each other so that they can go through this experience together. And they kind of joke that they're a little family, and they make up stories, but very quickly they start to have very awkward interactions, and they become quite nasty to each other in moments, in dialogue, where I almost was left thinking, is this really happening? Are we supposed to trust Nell's perspective? Are they really saying these things to her? Is she really having this much animosity between these characters, or is she imagining it? And then you kind of go, oh, maybe it's the house is getting under their skin and it's making them act this way to each other. That goes on throughout the story, and it's never really explained one way or the other. There are supernatural elements to her novel. And as there should be. It's a novel about a haunted house, so there are supernatural elements, some of which you see in the show. Like they have banging on the wall, there's writing on the wall that appears, there's a a dog that wanders through the house at night. There's a nursery that has cold air in the doorway, and various other things that happen. And they're hard to explain those things, but in many ways they come across to me as a distraction from the very weird social interactions that Eleanor has with the other people. She is constantly paranoid that they'll think she's stupid, that they might be making fun of her, that they don't like her, that she's doing the wrong thing. And so you see that she's come to the house with this trauma already, and it's not very clear where all it comes from, except for the fact that, you know, she's taking care of her mother who's died. But it becomes much more internalized as time goes on, and there are the supernatural elements, but the parts that are the scariest really just involve Nell and her psychological state. So
overall, you would say that the horror is perhaps more effective in the novel than it is in the TV show, because we were talking before we began recording this conversation about the fact that you thought there were two ways of presenting horror, and that Shirley Jackson sort of does a little bit of both.
Yeah. Well, so, yeah, I mean, in the novel, for me, I do think there are two ways of presenting horror. You can keep it vague, right, and nebulous, so that it's not clear, like, what does the ghost look like, or what is the sound that you're hearing, and you're always focused on the audience's experience or the character's experience of anticipating and imagining what will be horrifying. Or you can be very specific. You can show the ghost. You can show what the sound is. You can pinpoint it, which is what they do in the Netflix film. But if you do that, you still then have to provide the background, psychological material, if you will, from the characters to establish why were those the specific things that were so horrifying. Because on their own, they're just sort of I don't know, what would you call it, a phenomena. They're not horrifying. They don't haunt you. They don't stay with you if there's nothing behind them. It would be my argument. In the Netflix show, I don't think that they provide that. They get very specific about what the ghosts are, but they don't provide that background psychological material to allow those things to stay with you and haunt you. In the novel, there are some supernatural things that happen that are hard to explain, and they're a little jarring. I found them a little jarring because it was like, what is this? What's happening? I don't know. But they are paired with enough of this very, I don't know, hard to pinpoint, unnerving anxiety, I guess, of these latent issues that, you know, there's tension there. And so for me, what stays with me from the novel is not necessarily the really weird supernatural stuff I can't explain. It's the way that stuff distracted from my trying to understand what was going on with Nell psychologically. And I really feel like that is what happens. It's banging on the wall, and you try to figure out what's banging on the wall, and you don't realize, like, Nell's going nuts. And she gives indications that she's kind of aware that she's going to go nuts. And she imagines that the banging on the wall is her mother banging for her. And there's various things that happen that, you know, that connect those things. But it's the stuff you can't put your finger on, usually, that haunts you and stays with you. And there's too many things that make Nell uncomfortable, and I think it points too much to our own vulnerability as people to be misunderstood and to willingly misunderstand somebody else, or just weird tensions that arise when you're trying to make relationships with people and you're trying to be comfortable, whether you just meet, as in the case of these 4 people at the house, or you are a family and you are trying to live your life and be happy in your home. There's so many ways that we miss each other, misunderstand each other, and she has this trauma that we don't really ever find out that much about, but it's there, and it just kind of lingers in this latent state, and then it bubbles up with these weird interactions that she has with other people, and that part is very disturbing.
And the banging on the wall is something that in the show, it simply goes largely unexplained.
Right.
It's one of those examples of what I was talking about before when I'm talking about the lack of depth, because it seems to be, to me at least, it comes across as some sort of a gimmick that
Right.
is used
Right.
way too many times in the
Right.
show, and you are left wondering what is going to happen,
Right.
what is this, and there's really no fulfillment to this anxiety
Right.
of wanting to know what is happening
Right.
and why there's this banging on the doors and on the wall, which should be in a certain way explained, or at least hinted
at, yeah.
For it to be effective.
And I feel like I've only read this book once, and I don't know any critical research about it. I feel like it's worth looking at again, because I do think there's a lot in there that's just latent. And I think one thing I will say is the various deaths that are associated with Hill House in the novel, most of them, maybe not quite all, but most of them are women. And they're many of them, they're single women. Some of them are sisters. Somebody is a companion. Somebody like a companion caretaker. Nell, in many ways, is kind of a double of an earlier companion caretaker, because she has to take care of her mother, who then dies. She has a bad relationship with her sister as well, and you hear about these 2 sisters, from the original family, the Crane family, and they have a very bad relationship. And a lot of the horror around their stories it's not revealed. I mean, you don't get that Scooby-Doo moment in the book either of here's what happened and why. But it's hinted at that there's a lot that has gone on for all of these women, that they've lived very isolated lives. They've had a lot of weight on them to take care of sick people, or there have been misunderstandings for women who had no recourse to stand up for themselves. Eleanor, for instance, doesn't really own anything and almost can't take a car to drive to Hill House because she owns it with her sister, and her sister won't acknowledge that part of it's hers. We have a woman who is kind of driven nuts by her sister, who wants her share of Hill House, and yet this woman who wants her share of Hill House doesn't get it, and and she kind of becomes a bit of a scapegoat for some of the bad things that happen, and yet she I don't know. So there's just a lot of weird things that happen, and again, it's mostly to the female characters. And it's not articulated, but there's a lot there that's latent that could be explored, and I just feel like it has a whole lot more depth to it.
Well, you mentioned to me, though, that this novel has seemed to you, in many ways, a very modern novel for 1959.
Yeah, it does. To me, it does. The characters seem quite modern. I mean, Eleanor obviously is a very sheltered, almost childlike character, but the way that these 3 young people come on their own for this kind of it would be seen even today as a weird thing to do, an extreme experiment, to say, I'm going to go live in this haunted house. Now what wouldn't be today so strange is like women being on their own.
But in 59.
But in 59, you have to keep that in mind, that Nell wanting to go on her own to a house with other men, without much explanation, it would be an extreme thing to do. And Theodora as well comes as a single woman, and she's portrayed in the Netflix show as a lesbian character, and I've heard other people talking about other versions of the film and saying Theo is a lesbian character. And what's interesting to me is that in the novel, it's absolutely possible that she could be. She comes, and all we know is that she shares an apartment with a partner. I would go so far as to say you can't tell that, because in 1959 it would have been just as, maybe not just as, but it would have been extreme as well for her to live unmarried with a man in an apartment and act very casually about it as she does. So her sexuality, I suppose, is ambiguous in the novel, but just as much as Eleanor's is. Eleanor and Theo seem to be interested in Luke in different ways, but then they also, the two women, Eleanor and Theodore, have a very strong homosocial connection to each other that is reminiscent of, Victorian stories about, schoolgirls, girls in boarding school, and the homoerotic, homosocial relationships that a lot of girls had. And so, that's there. But Nell and Theo are loving to each other and incredibly nasty to each other. And what seems very modern to me is that Eleanor, for being a pretty traditional childlike character, gives us, through the narration from her perspective, some very modern, honest thoughts. I don't know, that's not the right way to describe it, but she imagines wanting to kill Theo. She's just incredibly mad at Theo for basically, not for no reason, but for wanting attention. And Shirley Jackson is able to articulate these things in a way that I don't think would have been in any way socially acceptable in 1959. Eleanor talks about how her mother wouldn't want her to leave dishes on the table for Mrs. Dudley to remove in the morning, except, Mrs. Dudley insists they have to do that. But she also is articulating to herself how angry she is at the doctor, at Luke, at Theodora for not taking her seriously, for making Theo the center of attention, or for underestimating her. She scoffs and laughs at the doctor in her mind when he believes all the simple, nice things she's saying while she's hiding these much darker thoughts. And so Shirley Jackson is very honest in that way, in articulating like nasty anger that I think that's what came across as very modern to me from Nell's perspective, because I don't think angry women were socially acceptable in 1959, given how socially unacceptable they are today. So yeah, that was incredibly interesting. I just think that the Netflix show missed out on a lot. And you had told me, Anton, that Stephen King said something about this new version of the show.
Yes, and in fact, that was one of the things that really drew my attention. Not because I'm a huge Stephen King fan, but because Stephen King is a really well-known and highly respected author of horror novels, probably one of the most famous in the 20th century. Yeah. And I have the quote here from The Independent, where he said, Stephen King is quoted as saying, "I don't usually care for this kind of revisionism, but this is great. Close to a work of genius, really. I think Shirley Jackson would approve, but who knows for sure." This is what Stephen King is quoted as saying about the Netflix TV show, The Haunting of Hill House, which is now available on Netflix, and that we've been discussing along with the novel from 1959 by Shirley Jackson. And so when I read that, besides all the great reviews that have been lavished upon this TV show, I thought, wow, this must be great. I have to watch this. And maybe all this hype has, been one of the reasons why I am fairly disappointed
Yeah.
in the actual finished product. But I think you're asking about this Stephen King quote because there is another Stephen King quote in this Penguin edition of the novel that sort of goes a little bit against.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe Stephen King is just trying to spread a little love in the world these days, and that's, I mean, like, I don't know why he would have been so friendly about what he's saying, but regardless, I'm gonna pit Stephen King against himself because he's quoted as having said about Shirley Jackson's The Haunting. I really can't say
About the novel.
About the novel. Quote, "It is the character of Eleanor and Shirley Jackson's depiction of it that elevates The Haunting of Hill House into the ranks of the great supernatural novels. Indeed, it seems to me that it and James's The Turn of the Screw are the only two great novels of the supernatural in the last 100 years." Unquote.
Okay.
Okay, so I wholeheartedly agree with the quote I just read, at least the first half of it. I absolutely believe that the characterization of Eleanor, and I think it would be clear to anybody who read the novel, is the key to The Haunting of Hill House. I don't put it on the same footing as The Turn of the Screw. But
I wouldn't either.
And
even though I haven't read it.
Here's the thing about James's The Turn of the Screw, and I don't want to ruin that for people who haven't read it, but you end up with a scenario, and it's the same kind of thing. I used to teach this in my British literature class. You have students who are ready to go, the governess is crazy. I can explain this because the governess is crazy. There are other people who say, no, the house is haunted and it's ghosts. So it's ghosts or she's crazy. It's ghosts or she's crazy. And I read a study once from a woman, I think her name is Elizabeth Earmarth. I'm taking this off the top of my head. I haven't looked it up in years. But who said the real horror of James's The Turn of the Screw is that it takes away the perception of reality that Victorians, built the novel out of. Consensus of reality. So much of what Victorian novels do is they give different characters perspectives. If you're watching the PBS Woman in White, a lot of what they do is the different testimonies from people, so you get the series of perspectives. And when you put the consensus together, that's supposed to give you the reality. And what Earmarth says happens in James's The Turn of the Screw is that it takes that consensus away. It is impossible to find out what happens, if she's crazy or if it's ghosts. Now, you can take that, for what you will, if you've read that or if you've seen any of the movie versions. But when you go back and you look at that, I mean, it's horrifying to not be able to figure out one way or the other what's happening. And I think Jackson in her book does come close to that, not with the supernatural stuff, which I feel like is mostly there as a distraction from what's really scary, which is what's going on with Nell. And none of that is really explained with Nell either. So, I mean, it gets close to it. I don't think it's equal to it. Another scary piece of literature, if you're interested in Gothic scary literature, is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Christabel, which is a poem that not as many people know as the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but you have supernatural elements in that poem as well that are pretty disturbing, but they're anchored by these very vague, nebulous, but unnerving stories about the family. Things that are implied but not stated. And so I think I would recommend to everybody that you read the book and think about what really makes a scary house scary.
Well, about the show, Stephen King says close to a work of genius. And then he says, I think Shirley Jackson would approve, but who knows for sure? You didn't seem to agree with that.
No, I don't know why he said that. I don't think that's true. I don't think she would have approved, and I don't know why he said that. I mean, I don't know. You know, there are elements in Jackson's story where they kind of act like maybe it is just the house. So I'm not saying like the Netflix show could play with that idea. Oh, that it's just the house and it's just haunted. But it's not so much that it's just the house. It's that we have a willingness to want to make it just the house. And it's like if it's just the house, then there's not so much to be afraid of.
It's not really much of a story.
You just don't go to that house,
yeah.
right? But what's really scary is it's not just the house, it's people. Like, we haunt ourselves all the time. We're freaking scary, you know?
With or without reason. But.
And, I mean, there's, I think, a lot more to be said about this. But, you know, like, Mrs. Dudley is a really interesting character, and they don't do nearly enough in the Netflix show. And to be honest, Jackson puts a good foundation in there for her, but doesn't do a lot with her either. But I mean, somebody that was really interested in studying the female characters in horror could do a lot with this book. Because, you know, for people who, like, they talk about the characters, they don't want to be alone in the house. They need to stay together. Weird things happen. And yet, Mrs. Dudley's been up and down that house by herself, keeping it clean, putting things away, you know, and they don't even interview her, you know, to get her perspective. And maybe she doesn't want to share it. She's not very social with them. She's quite strange.
Maybe she could fill in some clues.
But it's strange that they don't even talk to her about it. Now, she claims she doesn't stay after dark, and so maybe she doesn't experience some of these things. But there is a lot of interest in, you know, caretakers, housekeepers, the sisters even, who, the Crane sisters are very caught up in the belongings of the house.
Yeah, not very many male characters in that book.
No, and I mean, Luke and the doctor are there, and there's another guy named Arthur. They're there, but to me, they're not really
essential.
They're more like witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's more about the female characters. I don't know if that's fair, but that was my feeling about it. Yeah, so I think there's plenty in there. You know, it's definitely worth a read, and the show was worth watching. But it didn't stay with me.
Yeah, I was going to ask you as we're winding down the conversation, and the coffee pot is now empty. We've taken care of all the coffee here and of the brownies and everything else. What is your overall opinion, your overall appraisal of this Netflix show that just came out, The Haunting of Hill House?
My overall appraisal, I really, really, really didn't like it. I don't know. I really liked some of the actors. I thought I was even open to that idea of children being in it, because, you know, I think there is something to be said about the idea of not just people being scared, but children being scared. That creates a lot of strong emotions, and that can be on two levels. I mean, you could think of your own children, or you could think of yourself as a child and childhood fears. I mean, that can be very compelling. But I would say that even though the children have some terrifying experiences, and I joked earlier, like, why didn't the parents get their kids out of that house? The children overall don't seem afraid. For having had terrifying experiences, they go through the house by themselves all the time. They separate. They don't stay together. There's not even any talk of staying together. And that's actually a large part of what you hear in the book, is these people, they have to have a plan about how to stay together, how to keep the doors open, how to find their way in the house because it's confusing. And there's none of that in the movie. So, I mean, if they were going to bring in this element of childhood fear with these children characters, like, I just seems like a series of missed opportunities. And it had, by jumping back and forth between the past and the present and overlapping stories, I thought that they were going to have some more interesting elements of history, and it didn't do it. And with the house itself, you got some images of it being a beautiful house here and there, but they honestly didn't do very much with it. And even the room with the red door, the nursery or whatever, where all of the different red room, which I guess is in many ways a reference to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre goes into the red room early on and is haunted by the ghost of her uncle, and it's a pretty terrifying experience. And I laughed because the last time I read that book, the walls are not even red. Mm-hmm. I had always remembered it as this room with bright red walls, and it's the material around the bed. It's this dark damask red fabric, so it's disorienting because the room wasn't even red. But that element in the Netflix show wasn't really very scary either, because all they imagine in this elaborate Gothic home is one little nook that becomes a toy room, that becomes a playroom, an arcade room, a dance room, a library sitting room for the mom.
And an overall mystery room.
And a mystery room. But then they have all these elaborate rooms with the staircase and these windows and probably a library and all these different... And I don't think they didn't make... And it has a lot of statues and what have you. I don't think they made a whole lot of use of that. Maybe I'm not being fair, but I just felt like it was a big missed opportunity.
It's the red room and not red room, as in The Shining by Stephen King. I totally agree with what you're saying. Your appraisal of the show is very similar to mine. I would go back to what I said at the beginning. It was a big disappointment for me because I was expecting more, perhaps. Also because the show has been hyped quite a bit. Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons why it has been popular is that it tries to go back to the classic style of telling a horror story, but I don't think it does it as well as maybe it could have been done. But most of all, it is not the storytelling itself. It is not the cinematic aspects themselves. It's more the lack of depth of the story that I think, that's the main thing. You have to tell a story that is compelling, that has depth, and that is well constructed. Right. I think it is somewhat lacking in that respect, and for that reason alone, the show has been a disappointment to me. Not to say that people shouldn't watch it.
No,
I think
you should because
it's well worth watching it.
Yeah.
But I was expecting a lot more, and I wish I could say the opposite, but I really can't. Maybe what I should do now is read the book and rewatch or watch the older versions of this story.
I think we could do that. Take a look at them. I did hear somebody. You had some show on earlier, and they were talking about the moment with Nell and the bent neck lady, and they were like, that's just my definition of hell, that experience of seeing yourself being terrified by your own ghost over and over. And as much as I agree that moment was a good climax and it was scary, I don't think that's far from what I would imagine as a good definition of hell. I just can think of so many other horrible, terrifying, traumatizing, lingering, haunting things, because that just happened in real everyday life too. At least for Nell in that situation, like, she had a happy family, and that moment of terror was not her normal. And there are moments of terror that are normalized for a lot of people in the world, and so and that's more of what Eleanor her character gets at in the book, is that normalized terror that you can't even put your finger on, but it haunts you. And so I don't agree. I just don't think it was the epitome of horror. But I'm glad they did it.
it's a good show overall. It just did not live up to my personal expectations of it. And I think with this, Erin, we might be able to conclude
Yeah.
our conversation since the coffee's gone and the brownies are gone.
Yeah.
And we've been talking for quite a while about this show that has definitely not left us indifferent.
Right.
I will say that the show is The Haunting of Hill House, directed by Mike Flanagan. It's just out on Netflix here in the United States, and I assume all over the world. So if you get a chance, go watch it. And also, if you get a chance to read the book, which has been reissued on Penguin, The Haunting of Hill House, a novel by Shirley Jackson from back in 1959. And the cover that I have right here in front of me of the book is the same cover as the cover of the TV show.
Right.
And it says in a little circle here, inspiration for the Netflix series. And that is for sure the truth. It is
Yeah.
the inspiration
Yeah.
for the Netflix series. The Netflix series is not a faithful
No.
adaptation in any way of this novel by Shirley Jackson. And apparently only season 1 is available, and there may be no season 2 because the director, Mike Flanagan, has said, and I quote, "As far as I've ever been concerned with this, the story of the Crane family is told, and it's done." So that's it. Watch it on Netflix, and thank you very much for listening to our conversation about The Haunting of Hill House, which was recorded live in Jackson, Tennessee, in the United States of America in the year 2018, and the copyright is ours, Anton and Erin Garcia-Fernandez. You'll be able to listen to this episode of our conversation on The Haunting of Hill House on my YouTube channel, Anton GF, very soon. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Anton.
And thanks everybody for listening. So long, everybody.